When I first met Daniel, he was nothing more than my husband's colleague. At least, that's how it began. He worked with Mark at a downtown firm, one of those polished offices with glass walls, tailored suits, and people who measured success in promotions and late-night emails. Mark mentioned him often, but always casually. Daniel landed us that big account. Or, Daniel's the only guy who doesn't lose his cool when things go wrong. To me, Daniel was just another name. Another faceless man in the world my husband lived in. The kind of men who shook hands too firmly at company gatherings and laughed a little too loudly at boardroom jokes. Then came that Friday evening. Mark had insisted on hosting a small dinner at our house for a few of his colleagues. I wasn't thrilled. Entertaining his coworkers always felt like stepping into a role I never auditioned for. The perfect wife, the charming hostess, smiling on cue, nodding through conversations about financial reports and office politics I didn't care about. Still, I did everything properly. I set the table with our best china, lit candles, and poured wine into crystal glasses. I wore a simple black dress. Elegant, understated, carefully chosen not to attract attention. Or so I thought. Daniel was the first to arrive. I opened the door and found myself looking into striking green eyes. Not the kind that simply observe you, but ones that search, linger, as if they've discovered something hidden. He was taller than Mark, broader in the shoulders, carrying a quiet confidence that seemed to enter the room before he did. "Hi, you must be Emily," he said, extending his hand. His voice was warm, steady, effortlessly confident. "Yes, and you're Daniel," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, but it wasn't the handshake I remembered. It was the way he looked at me, like he was actually seeing me, not just acknowledging me. The evening unfolded like any other dinner party. Guests arrived. Laughter filled the living room. Plates were passed around. Mark played the perfect host, telling jokes and refilling glasses. I moved between guests, making sure everyone was comfortable, smiling politely, playing my part. But every so often, my eyes drifted toward Daniel, and every time I looked, he was already looking back. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't intrusive. It was subtle. Brief glances that lingered just a second too long, leaving something warm behind. I told myself I was imagining it, that it meant nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But something inside me had already started to shift. By dessert, the air between us felt different. Not loud, not visible, but present. In the smallest moments, the brush of his hand when I passed the wine, the faint smile that lingered a little longer than necessary whenever our eyes met. When the evening finally ended, guests began to leave. Daniel stayed behind for a moment. Mark was occupied saying goodbye to someone else, so for a brief moment, it was just the two of us. "Dinner was wonderful," Daniel said softly. "You really have a gift for making people feel at home." "Thank you," I replied, my voice quieter than I expected. And then it happened. That look. It wasn't just a glance. It was an unspoken confession. His eyes held mine, steady and unwavering, as if acknowledging everything we had both pretended not to notice all evening. My breath caught. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The voices, the laughter, even Mark in the background. Only that silence between us remained. Then it ended. He nodded politely, said goodnight, and stepped out into the night. But the moment stayed. It followed me as I cleaned the dishes. It followed me as Mark talked about office politics. It followed me as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Because in that look, I had felt something I hadn't felt in years. Something dangerous, intoxicating, and impossible to ignore. After that night, I told myself it meant nothing, that it was just a moment shaped by wine, conversation, and the artificial intimacy of hosting guests in my own home. But denial has a strange way of weakening when reality begins to echo it, because in the days that followed, I started noticing Daniel everywhere I hadn't noticed him before. Not physically, but in the gaps of conversation when Mark mentioned work, in the pauses between routine domestic noise, in the quiet seconds when my mind drifted without permission, and each time his name surfaced in passing, something subtle tightened inside me. Not loud enough to call desire, not strong enough to name as regret, but present enough to unsettle the balance I had maintained for years, And what made it worse, or perhaps what made it impossible to ignore, was that Daniel himself did not overstep, did not chase, did not speak in ways that could be easily condemned. Instead, he remained exactly what he had always been on the surface. Polite, composed, professional, yet somehow that restraint felt intentional, as if silence itself had become his language, and every unspoken word carried more weight than any conversation ever could, and I found myself replaying fragments of that evening without meaning to, the exact angle of his gaze, the slight hesitation before he looked away, the warmth in his voice when he spoke to me compared to how he spoke to others, until memory stopped feeling like memory and started feeling like something alive, something that kept breathing even when I tried to suppress it, and slowly, without any dramatic turning point or clear decision, I began to feel the structure of my daily life shift in invisible ways. Mark's presence remained the same, steady and familiar, but my attention no longer rested where it should have. It drifted, always drifting, towards something I could not define, and therefore could not fully resist. And I hated myself a little for that, not because anything had happened, but because nothing had, and still it was enough to change the way I saw silence, distance, and even my own reflection, until one afternoon when Mark casually mentioned that Daniel would be working more closely with him on a new project and might be visiting our home again for a follow-up meeting, and I remember feeling an unexpected stillness in my chest, not excitement exactly, not fear either, but something suspended between the two, like standing at the edge of a door that had not yet opened but already knew it would. The weeks seemed to stretch endlessly after that. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was assigning meaning to ordinary moments, yet every time Mark mentioned the upcoming meeting, I felt a quiet anticipation I couldn't explain away. When the evening finally arrived, I spent far too long deciding what to wear, only to settle on something simple and convince myself it hadn't mattered. The lie was obvious even to me. By the time the doorbell rang, my pulse was already quicker than it should have been. Mark welcomed Daniel inside with the easy familiarity of a colleague, unaware of the storm of awareness that entered the room with him. Daniel greeted me politely, no differently than before, and somehow that made everything harder. There was no secret smile, no obvious signal, nothing that could justify the tension I felt. Yet every glance seemed charged with things neither of us intended to say. As Mark discussed figures, deadlines, and contracts, I moved around the room preparing coffee, pretending to focus on anything except the fact that I was acutely aware of Daniel's presence. More than once, I caught him watching me, and each time he looked away just slowly enough to leave doubt behind. Was it real? Was I imagining it? The uncertainty became its own kind of intoxication. Later, when Mark stepped away to answer a phone call, an unexpected silence settled between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The ticking of the clock suddenly seemed louder than the conversation that had filled the room minutes before. Daniel looked toward me, his expression thoughtful, almost hesitant. "You seem different tonight," he said quietly. The comment caught me off guard. "Different how?" I asked. He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary before answering. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe just distant. Like you're thinking about something you don't want to think about." The words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. A nervous smile touched my lips. That's a very specific observation. Maybe I'm observant. For a moment, neither of us looked away. The space between us felt smaller than it actually was. Neither of us moved. Neither of us crossed any line. Yet the air seemed full of possibilities that were better left untouched. Then Mark returned, carrying the noise of the outside world back into the room, and the moment vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But something had changed. Not because of what was said, because of what wasn't. And as the evening continued, I realized the most dangerous part wasn't that Daniel might feel something. It was that I was beginning to hope he did. As the days passed, that realization refused to leave me alone, settling quietly into the corners of my mind and appearing at the most unexpected moments, during morning coffee, while folding laundry, while sitting beside Mark on the couch as he talked about work without noticing how distracted I had become, and what troubled me most was not the possibility that Daniel felt something for me, but the fact that I had begun measuring ordinary days against brief moments that involved him, as though a part of me had started waiting for something I knew should never happen, and every time I tried to dismiss those thoughts, another memory surfaced. Another glance, another unfinished conversation, another silence that somehow said more than words ever could, until eventually the anticipation became impossible to ignore, because Daniel was no longer just a distant figure connected to my husband's professional life. He had become a question that followed me everywhere, a mystery that seemed to grow larger the more I tried to avoid it. And then came another evening when Mark mentioned, almost casually, that the three of us would be attending a company event the following weekend, a simple gathering at a hotel downtown. Nothing unusual, nothing important. Yet the moment he said it, I felt my heartbeat change, and I hated myself for noticing, hated myself even more for looking forward to it. Because deep down I already knew I would spend far too much time wondering whether Daniel would be there, what he would say, whether he would look at me the same way he always did. And when the night of the event finally arrived, the ballroom was filled with music, conversation, and the polished elegance of people pretending their lives were exactly as they wanted them to be. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the room, laughter drifted through the air, glasses clinked together, and yet despite all the movement around me, my attention found him almost immediately, standing across the room speaking with a group of executives, looking completely at ease, completely composed, as though he carried none of the uncertainty that had taken hold of me. And for a moment I considered turning away, focusing on the event, focusing on my husband, focusing on anything else. But then Daniel looked up, and our eyes met through a crowd of strangers, and something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it, enough to make the noise around us fade into the background. And even though several people stood between us, it felt as if the distance had disappeared entirely, and throughout the evening we crossed paths again and again, always briefly, always innocently, exchanging polite words whenever circumstances required it. Yet beneath every conversation there seemed to be another one happening silently, hidden beneath the surface, built from pauses and lingering looks and things neither of us dared to say aloud. And the closer the night moved toward its end, the stronger that invisible pull became, until eventually I found myself standing alone on a quiet terrace overlooking the city lights, escaping the crowded ballroom for a few minutes of fresh air. Standing alone on that terrace, I tried to convince myself that the cool night air would clear my thoughts, but instead it seemed to sharpen them, making every emotion feel more vivid than before. And as I rested my hands against the railing and looked out over the sea of city lights stretching into the darkness, I became aware of footsteps approaching behind me, slow and unhurried, and somehow, before I even turned around, I already knew who it was, because by then I had become far too familiar with the feeling of his presence. And when Daniel stepped onto the terrace, neither of us appeared surprised to find the other there, as though some unspoken understanding had guided us both to the same place at the same time. And for a moment we simply stood in silence, listening to the distant hum of traffic below and the muffled music drifting through the ballroom doors behind us, neither willing to be the first to speak, because both of us seemed to understand that once words entered the conversation, something would inevitably change. And eventually Daniel broke the silence with a quiet observation about the view, something simple, something harmless. Yet even the most ordinary sentence sounded different in the stillness of that night, and our conversation unfolded slowly after that, moving from casual topics to more personal ones without either of us realizing exactly when the shift occurred, talking about ambitions, regrets, missed opportunities, and the strange ways life sometimes leads people toward paths they never expected to walk. And with every passing minute, I found myself revealing more than I normally would, sharing thoughts I rarely spoke aloud, while Daniel listened with a level of attention that felt almost unsettling because he never interrupted, never rushed to fill a silence, never seemed distracted. And there was something deeply disarming about being listened to that way, especially after years of feeling as though most conversations in my life existed on the surface. And as the night continued, I began noticing small details that only made my thoughts more complicated. The way his expression softened when he spoke about things that mattered to him, the way his eyes seemed to hold genuine curiosity whenever I shared something personal, the way he remembered tiny details from conversations that most people would have forgotten entirely. And for the first time, I started wondering whether what connected us wasn't merely attraction, but something potentially more dangerous, because attraction can often be dismissed as temporary, but understanding is far more difficult to ignore, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it forced me to confront a question I had spent weeks avoiding. Was I drawn to Daniel because he was different? Or because he somehow reflected parts of myself that I had forgotten existed? Parts buried beneath routine and responsibility and years of predictable comfort. And while those thoughts raced through my mind, another silence settled between us, a comfortable silence this time, one that felt strangely natural, and when our eyes met again there was no surprise left in either of us, no confusion about the fact that something undeniable existed beneath the careful politeness we had maintained for so long, yet neither of us crossed any boundary, neither of us spoke the words hanging between us, because sometimes, as we walked back toward the ballroom, I expected the spell of the terrace to break, expected reality to return the moment the noise, the lights, and the crowd surrounded us again, but reality had something entirely different waiting for me, because the instant we stepped through the doors, I noticed an unusual tension in the room, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that seemed completely out of place among the laughter and music. And before I could understand what was happening, I saw Mark, standing near the center of the ballroom holding a microphone, smiling in a way I hadn't seen for months, while dozens of guests slowly gathered around him, their attention fixed on a large projection screen that had suddenly illuminated the far wall, and for a moment I assumed it was some corporate presentation or company announcement. But then Mark began speaking, thanking everyone for their friendship, their support, and their loyalty over the years, his voice growing more emotional with every sentence, and I felt a strange unease settle in my chest because none of this had been mentioned before, none of this made sense, and when I glanced toward Daniel, I was startled to discover that he looked equally confused, his confident expression replaced by genuine concern, and then, without warning, the screen behind Mark flickered to life, displaying a series of photographs from our marriage, vacations, anniversaries, family gatherings, memories from years I had almost forgotten, and the room filled with warm smiles and applause while I stood frozen in place, unable to understand where this was leading, until Mark took a deep breath and said words that seemed to stop time itself. Tonight isn't a celebration of success. It's a goodbye. The entire room fell silent. My heart slammed against my ribs. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mark lowered the microphone slightly and continued, revealing that he had accepted a position overseas months earlier, a position that would require him to leave the country permanently within a few days, a secret he had kept from nearly everyone until tonight, including me, and before I could even process that revelation, before I could comprehend the fact that my husband had been planning a completely different future without ever telling me, he looked directly at me and said something that sent a shock through every person in the room. The hardest part, he admitted quietly, was deciding whether to tell the truth about why I'm leaving. A murmur spread through the crowd. My blood ran cold. Then Mark's eyes shifted toward Daniel. Not angrily, not accusingly, calmly, almost sadly. And in that terrifying moment, I realized this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't an announcement. This was something else entirely. Something prepared. Something planned. Mark reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded envelope that looked old, worn from being opened and closed many times, and as every guest watched in stunned silence, he revealed that months before Daniel had ever set foot in our house, before that first dinner, before the glances, before the tension, before any of it, Daniel had already known something neither of us knew about ourselves, a secret connected to our pasts that had remained buried for decades, and just as Mark began